first video of our computer science series. This series will follow the AP Computer Science A curriculum, but you can also use it as an introductory course to learn coding if you would like. All the code is done in Java and it follows Java concepts, so any information presented here will adhere to that. Just be aware of that. So today we will be talking about various data types and variables and develop a thorough understanding of this conceptually. Let's get started. To begin with, let's explore variables. Variables are essentially like symbols that store information in different categories. And you've probably heard the term variables in math, and this is very similar to that concept where variables represent a piece of information. And in this case, it's just that the programmer is assigning it a value. Now, let's also understand what a data type is in computer science. When coding, all variables must be defined by a data type for this course. This means that they are essentially assigned to a category where they belong and they can be recognized by the computer. Later in this series, we will go over like syntax of declaring and instantiating these data types and variables, but for now, let's just get a good grasp of what it actually is. Now let's understand a crucial concept in data types, which is primitive data versus non-primitive data. Primitive data is data that must be predefined at the start of a program. This data typically stores a value and it will throw an error if it is left undefined. Primitive data cannot store a null value, and I'll explain what a null value is later in the slideshow. A non-primitive data type, also known as a reference type, does not have to be defined at the start of the code and can be assigned the value of null. This is a major difference between the two, and later on you will also be able to see these various types and actions and see why we would have to have primitive data versus non-primitive data. But for now, just know that there are two different types. So let's talk about the various primitive data types. There are 8 of these in Java, but the AP exam only utilizes 4 of them. The first type is byte. This only requires 1 byte of memory, and it is used to store small numbers to save memory space. Next, we have short. This takes 2 bytes and stores a slightly larger range of numbers. Next, we have a very common data type, which is you will see in the course pretty much all the time, is the int. As the name says, it stores integers and in that given range that uses 4 bytes of memory. If you notice, the higher the range of numbers, the larger the memory space required, and this can be helpful if, for instance, you need to use less memory space and you don't need such big numbers, then you can resort to using like a byte or a short. But if you need bigger numbers, you can use an int. We also have long, which stores up to an extremely large value of both negative and positive integers. Keep in mind that these cannot store decimals. Now, obviously, we'd want a type that could store a decimal. So we have float and double, which both store various decimals, but the double can actually store a larger decimal, so to a larger decimal place. We also have Boolean. Now, this is interesting because the only 2 values that a Boolean can store are true and false. So this can be used to validate or compare a statement. Finally, we have char, which stores a character that is identified by the ASCII values in Java. And basically, what the ASCII is just like a library of symbols that can be utilized in Java code and be read by the computer. Now let's talk about our non-primitive data types. For this video, we are only going to talk about strings and arrays, but the other types are also valid reference types. Strings can essentially store messages, and the syntax for this is to be put into 2 double quotes. But again, we'll talk about syntax in a later video. So in these strings, you can store like words and sentences, as well as any kind of user input that consists of multiple letters. That's a pretty basic understanding of it, but for now, again, that's all we really need to know. Now, arrays, which also come up later in the series, and we go a lot more into depth with that, but just for now, this is a type of data structure that acts as like a table to store multiple data values. So as of now, we've only discovered that these certain data values can store just one number or just one letter. But in this case, this can store a table of multiple letters. So it's very like versatile in that sense. So if you remember earlier, I mentioned we would come back to this term of null. So the only things that can be defined as null are reference types. So this means that they hold no definite value and can be overwritten at any time later in the code without throwing an error. That's a key point here, is that the thing is, if you use primitive data, it has to be given a value at the start of the code. Otherwise, you're going to have an error later saying that there is no value assigned to this variable. So the thing about this is that primitive types can actually not be assigned null. They have to be assigned a certain value. But these reference types can be assigned null, and these can actually be changed later on in the code without throwing you some kind of error. So it's very useful in that sense. And this is one of the big things that separates reference types from primitive data types. You will see how null affects code and certain errors that can happen later in the series. But for now, this is a good place to stop. So, hopefully, this was a very helpful introductory video on reference types and variables. And in the next video, we will go over the syntax of defining and declaring these variables. So, thank you for watching, and please make sure to subscribe to our channel for more helpful computer science videos and more STEM subjects. Thank you so much.